Well, hey, I'm with Dr. Rocky Dimino. Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. You have been a part of Vineyards, like Vineyard churches, for like over 20 years, and specifically the Houston Vineyard now for almost 7 years. And you are an OBGYN. You work in emergency obstetrics. Tell me a little bit about what you do before we get into this COVID conversation.
Sure. I'm, as you said, an emergency OBGYN. So in the hospital, I see women coming into the hospital who have a problem in their pregnancy. I'm one of the first physicians she'll see, even if she has her own physician. I also have a little bit of a different perspective because I lead teams of doctors who do the same thing through multiple states in our country. So I have multiple teams of doctors who have all had different experiences as well.
Yeah, so you actually get this insight that very few people get because you're getting sort of firsthand reports of the effects of COVID-19. And we were talking a little bit earlier. I was fascinated by this. Like the majority of people that go into the hospital are going to go into one of two emergency rooms: the regular emergency room, or the ones you're working in.
Yes.
And then the other thing that I thought was really fascinating is that the majority of women under 40, if they are going to go into the hospital, they're going to show up in your emergency room.
Yes, because the majority of women under 40, their major issues are related to a pregnancy or a female-related problem. And so they'll come into one of our emergency rooms that are housed up on near labor and delivery. So we end up seeing a lot of people every day.
Yeah, you guys are busy. So as COVID, the reality of COVID hit, how has that impacted you guys in where you're working with and the people that you are serving and caring for and doctoring? What are some of the things you've seen?
So there are a few things that I've seen with our patients. The first one that just really strikes me as an obstetrician is, normally when you go into a hospital to have a baby, it's such a joyful, celebratory time in our lives. And with COVID seemed to steal that away from us. You're going into the hospital, you're worried about getting this disease and not knowing what it could do to you or your baby. You may not have the people around you that you want to be there. A lot of us want more than just our spouse there. We want our parents or other people or their children there because it's a family event. And then as you're having your baby, everybody around you in the hospital, they're all wearing, masks and gloves and gowns and, like every part of their body is covered, and it just seems so impersonal. And I think that remembering as healthcare providers and as families to not let COVID steal our joy is super important. We have to be able to manage COVID, but we can't let it steal our joy away.
Yeah, that is one of the things that I think is really difficult for a lot of us to think about, because unless you've lived through that, I remember the birth of my kids. It was this joyous, it's monumental, and part of the joy of it was going through with family, and then as family would come in and visit with the baby and everything else. And now all of a sudden, all of those things are taken away. And apart from that, there's just a fear of the unknown. We don't know, like, have you guys also saw sort of a decrease in the general population coming into the ERs as they become afraid that, man, I don't want to go anywhere near the hospital?
Yeah. A lot of us were afraid to go into hospitals. I mean, I admit myself, when my son was really sick at the beginning of March, I didn't want to take him in. I called my buddies in the ER and I was like, what do I do at home? Because I really didn't want to go to the hospital. And I think the same is very true for, men and women in general going into hospitals. They really tried to avoid it. And so we've seen, unfortunately, more serious complications of other things because people waited too long to go in. So they had this fear of making it into the hospital. But I would tell you right now, if you talk to most physicians or healthcare providers, we feel safer at work than we feel going to the grocery store right now. because at work, everybody is wearing a mask, right? And that mask, the mask is really a selfless thing. It is not there to protect the mask wearer. It's there to protect the people around them. And we can enforce that in the hospital. But when we go to the grocery store, you don't have that same experience. And people aren't as diligent about hand washing and other ways to protect people around them, not just themselves, as they are in the hospital. So right now we feel safer in the hospital than we do in the grocery store.
And I do, there is that reality. I mean, the reality is that you guys, as more and more information comes out about what COVID-19 does and how it spreads, you guys are able to, because you're designed this way, to make the adjustments needed to protect the patients and yourselves. And so I think it is a good thing. It's a good reminder that, like, if somebody's dealing with something, if you don't, like, go to the hospital, like, don't try to, like, brave this thing out and, like, oh, I'm just going to figure it out on my own. These are places that are uniquely prepared to give you the most protection that you can get.
Yeah, I mean, I think that initial, lockdown and keeping everybody at home was really, really important, because it allowed the medical community to catch up and get our supplies in order and figure out how to maneuver our protocols. That's a lot of what I was doing early on, was helping hospitals create their protocols to keep people safe. And once we were able to catch up, then it became a much safer place to be at. We needed several weeks, and we needed to build our supplies to make that happen. And so it's a better place. The other thing I saw with patients is really just, unfortunately, young, healthy people get really sick. And that's not something that many of us are used to seeing. Like, it's going to sound a little harsh to say, but when a 70, 80, 90-year-old person is getting sick, you're like, okay, well, they led a full life and they're getting sick, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the same as what COVID was doing. These were sometimes healthy 40-year-old men, or healthy 30-year-old women, or even children getting super sick. And some of them have long-term consequences of COVID. And so, like with children, I was telling you earlier, just, they might be asymptomatic earlier, but then some of them are getting this follow-up syndrome 4 to 6 weeks later. And that follow-up syndrome can be a critical event in their life. It can stop their heart, but it also causes some permanent cardiac damage in some of these children, unfortunately. And although that's very rare, these aren't kids that necessarily will play football in the future if they have cardiac damage. And so I think that this is something that we've learned more and more about this disease, but it's not a harmless thing for everybody. We just don't know what all of the long-term consequences are.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions I have for you is, like, as we see these, as you see, because here's the thing for you guys, as healthcare workers and professionals, you're seeing these things up front. So you're not seeing a news report of, hey, there can be some cardiac issues with kids with a secondary thing. You're seeing it happen, and you're not saying we're not reading the news that it's really hard to breathe and it's really painful. You're seeing it happen. How are you, like, as a doctor who sees these things and is putting yourself, you're going into the place where you're most likely to come into contagion, and you have a family at home. How are you guys processing this? Because it can't be an easy task. Like, like you were saying, some doctors are afraid to go into work in the beginning. It's like, hey, this is the realities that are harsh.
I spent a lot of the first month to 6 weeks of this pandemic basically talking with physicians one-on-one about their fear of going into work. And it's not even just fear for ourselves. It's really, if I get sick, I could make my kids sick. Or if I get sick, I can make my parents sick or my spouse sick. And I don't want to be the one responsible for making my family sick. I think many of us realized pretty early on with a pandemic, most pandemics historically last 18 months to 2 years. They last a long time. And so as we're thinking through these things, we're like, do I separate from my family, my kids, for even up to 2 years? Am I not going to see my parents for 2 years? What if something else gets them first, right? And I never got to
Yeah.
see them. How do you maneuver life with your family, and feel like you're protecting them? It is a really hard thing. And so I think a lot of us, we're debating between this sense of duty, or the sense of, many of us have a calling to be a physician, where we feel this sense of, this is what we're supposed to be doing. And it conflicts with our own personal fear. And there's a song, there's actually a worship song, and I'm going to forget what it's called, Josh, but it it talks about being brave, like David going into the lion's den. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I know. I'm gonna fail you on the name as well, but yeah.
Yeah, but when I hear that, I think about that. Like, as I driving into work, I often listen to worship music, and it's this, God, give me the bravery to go do what you're asking me to do, and having to have complete faith on Him that He's going to protect me and my family, and guide us. But that, I think that fear for those around us is huge, and some of us feel that same obligation of going, like, as church will eventually restart, if I'm seeing things at church, do I go to I mean, if I'm seeing things in the hospital, is it the right decision for me and my community to attend church with everybody else, or is it the right decision to then send my children to school? I don't know the answers to those, but those are some of the things that many of us debate about whether it's safe to do the general things in the community. I think now that we have a lot more protection at work, and we're feeling safer about being there, I don't think it's as much of a concern, but I still probably won't go see my parents for a while.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I really love about this. Like, first of all, the using the term calling for what you do, I think, is really adequate. And I think also the fact that there's this level of surrender to the call of God on your life as a doctor that leads you to put yourself in positions that would like normally cause fear and anxiety, and have to trust Him. It sort of becomes this sort of co-working between you and the Holy Spirit, just to sort of get through the day and fulfill the calling God has for you. And I think it's an incredibly beautiful thing. And I know there are a lot of healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, technicians, also, that are doing the same thing. And so I really, first of all, I want to thank you, because I know that it's sacrificial. And as we look at this, we had talked about this, you had said that the lockdown really helped you guys get organized, but now we talked about this earlier as well, you and I, but that we have to learn to live with this thing now. As much as lockdown was very helpful to get us, now as things are opening up, and isolation is starting to weigh on people, and we have to figure out how do we re-engage socially with still maintaining social distancing and all these things. There was something you said that I really loved. You said the church as a whole has had this mission for as long as it has existed, and it's still the mission today, which is to protect and care for our community. Like, that is still the mission of the church. Like, we still have to provide a place that is a protection and care for the community. And I think it mirrors back to what you said about the mask, that the best thing I can do is, when I'm engaging these things, to wear a mask as a selfless act, because it's not about my protection. It is about the protection of others. And I think that this is also an opportunity for us, because you're talking about your calling as a healthcare professional, as a doctor, as an emergency room physician. Like, you're talking about these things as calling, and in light of all the risks, dependency on the Holy Spirit and walking with God. And I think for us as followers of Jesus, it's a similar calling to be for our community and the people around us. And sometimes that requires us making some selfless acts that are and I think inviting the Holy Spirit into that is a really powerful way to embrace it. what do you see going forward? What are the ways that you see that God is positioning you, calling you to be sort of light for people? Because you clearly God's gifted you with influence and position. What does that look like as you go forward, as you keep having these hard conversations with doctors and nurses and people in your area of influence?
Well, I think there are there are a couple of different ways in my life that I think COVID will change me going forward. But I don't think that they're very different from what many other people will experience in their own ways. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how do we live chronically with this among us, right? You know, COVID's not going to go away for the next 18 months to 2 years. It will still be a part of our community. And so how do we balance my work obligations with my community obligations? And I feel
Yeah.
like that's huge, right? Um, and also your family obligations, right? Those are the same things that everybody else is thinking about right now. Um, you know, and what do I take forward from this lockdown with me that will be important for me as time goes on? Because not all of lockdown was bad, right?
No.
Um, I think a lot of us were pretty miserable, and we still are. You know, with all this, homeschooling experiences and working and being trapped in the house, you know, like um, there was a lot of it that was pretty miserable, right? But there were some pieces of that were really important, and so remembering to every day reflect upon what joys that day brought us and how can I carry that forward. How can, you know, in the areas that COVID stole my joy, where am I bringing joy back, not just for me,
Yeah.
but also for my family and my community? And for us, a lot of that is how do we continue to serve the people around me? Because that truly brings me joy. When I walk away from volunteering at the food pantry, there's this sense of like, I feel full, right? I feel
Yeah.
full and bubbly because, you know, there was something good that came of that. And so you can still, you know, try to reincorporate those things in your life. And it may be as simple as remembering to text people in your community and say, how are you doing today? Just checking in on people. Or, you know, gathering together in someone's yard. Maybe you're still 6, 8, 10 feet apart, but you can still gather and, you know,
Yeah.
see each other and bring each other some joy that way. Um, you know, how do we still remember to take care of each other? As long as now that many more people are without a job, those needs in our community are even much more, um, they're much greater than they were before. People who need just basics of food and shelter and clothing, and how do we continue to provide those things for each other and lift each other up during this time, I think is super important. And some of that is figuring out, you know, what do we do with our children as we balance going back to work, and, you know, whether or not they go back to school or
Yeah.
not. And how do we gather together as a community, I think is really important for us. You know, for us, part of our own mental health and our well-being come as humans from being part of a community with each other and with God. And a large part of that is gather together in things like worship. And, you know, outdoor events are wonderful. They're a great way to get together, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we continue to do some of that, um, and not let COVID take away everything, right?
Yeah.
I think those are some of the very important things, I think, to me.
And I think it's really powerful. And again, I just want to thank you because I know I know that this is a season of great stress for all of us, and I think specifically for healthcare workers and doctors and like yourself, you're not only doing it, but you're also overseeing and hearing the stories of other doctors, and so the weight that is it's a lot. And I just want to thank you for the sacrifices, for your commitment to following the calling God's placed in your life. And we really appreciate it. And thank you for your time today, because this is really helpful. It's really great to get a perspective, a personal perspective, as opposed to just all the stuff that's floating around on social media or on the news. And we value that a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And God bless you. And last thing, and then I'll let you go. If somebody's saying, hey, I really like to pray for, the healthcare professionals, what would be a simple thing? What would be a good prayer?
I think I would pray, one, for protection for them and their families. I would also pray that that God just gives them that bravery to go and do what they're called to do, and help them know that God is with them as they're walking through work each time that they're called to go in. And I think also to help them have compassion toward their patients in the same way that we used to. When you're scared of getting something from your patient, you detach, and you like I'll tell you one very specific scenario, and we can end on that if you want to. I went in to go deliver a baby, and her doctor hadn't made it. She was coming in kind of very toward the end, because she really wanted to wait as long as possible and not be there. I was dressed head to toe, and I look like a Martian, right? I've got this thing called a papper on, and we've got masks on and gloves. We're like completely covered. And as I ran into the room, the nurses are like plastered against the wall. They were like as far back as they could possibly be without seeming too obvious, because they wanted to keep their distance from this woman who is having her baby, and her husband. They're both wearing masks. And I remember, like, right after the baby delivered, I looked at the husband like, it's okay to come close. You can touch your baby. It's okay. And then I noticed that he had been Zooming with his family on this on his iPad during the delivery, which is what we're allowing to allow family members. And I'm looking at the people on the screen, and I was like waving hi to them. And I realized there was this older woman in one of the squares, and she was crying. And I said, who is that? Said that's the grandmother of this baby. And this is the first grandbaby she's witnessed being born, because she lives in another country. And for whatever reason, that just hit me. And I was like, you know what? If we didn't have COVID, she would have never seen that before, because we didn't allow that kind of stuff in the delivery rooms. And so afterwards, I had them, a lot of times I'll do a little family picture, with the mom, dad, and the baby. And I said, no, wait, get your iPad. And we held up that iPad in the background, because it involved all of their family members who attended this birth. And I just read, that was the moment when I was like, we can still have joy, right? We can still bring this as much as possible. We don't have to be so fearful and scared all the time. And it's moments that I wish that when people are praying, that they pray that healthcare providers still have those ideas in their head of how to bring this back and bring the compassion and the human touch back to healthcare.
Yeah, that we don't forget the humanity of all of us.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that. And so I think those are great prayers. And and I think there are going to be people praying for you. You specifically, but for all the healthcare providers and nurses, doctors, technicians, everybody that's involved, maintenance people in hospitals. I mean, there's just an army of people that are serving selflessly in hospitals to make sure that moments like that can happen, where a grandmother can see their first grandchild born because Zoom. Because Zoom.
Yeah, because of Zoom.
The ubiquitous Zoom. But hey, thank you again so much. God bless you. And this was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.